few days ago, there was a very important day for Israel. It was the anniversary that marked the unification of Jerusalem during the 6 Days War in 1967. Someone in Brussels didn't celebrate this. It's a widely recognized celebration in Israel where people are going to the streets, but in Brussels someone called it as illegal occupation. We will discuss further on the reunification of Israel, the reunification of Jerusalem, the future of Israel. And today I'm joined by the member of the European Parliament, Hermann Tertsch from Spain. Welcome.
Hello.
Welcome back, Charlie Weimers, a member of the European Parliament from Sweden.
Thank you.
Welcome, Charlie. And of course, with Tomas Sandell from the European Coalition for Israel. Welcome, Tomas.
Thank you.
Let's start with you, Tomas.
Yep.
Your organization organized a lot of reception, a lot of events during this important day. Why, for you, this is a very crucial day in the life of Israel?
Yes, thank you, Marco, for having me on the show again. And obviously, for the Jewish people, it's impossible to understand Jewish culture, Jewish history, Judaism, if we do not take into account the centrality of Jerusalem. And of course, as for a Christian, this may come as a surprise, because for us there is not any particular place that would have a similar importance. But even during the darkest hours of Jewish life in Europe, this was always the dream, one day, next year in Jerusalem, So that the Jewish people finally in 1967 were able to pray at their holy places at the Western Wall in Jerusalem. You can just imagine what it meant, not only for the Israelis, but for the global Jewish community. And I hope later in the program I will be able to elaborate why I believe that a future under Israeli sovereignty for a united Jerusalem is the best solution to make it compatible with our values, European values, and I'm thinking of religious freedom and coexistence and similar fundamental principles that history shows us clearly that this has only been in place during Israeli sovereignty. And I think that is why it is so important that also here in Brussels, the European Union would not only acknowledge but really celebrate the reunification of Jerusalem.
On this point, out of curiosity, what was the perception that you had when you were organizing a reception in Jerusalem on this day, and the perception that you had when you were organizing on this day a reception in Brussels? So there was a lot of difference between the two environments, let's say.
Yes, well, interestingly, in Jerusalem, of course, we were in Western Jerusalem, in West Jerusalem, which is basically pragmatically recognized by the international community as a capital, regardless of what the peace solution would be. So I don't think in that respect that it was so different. Of course, it's another thing to say, if you look at the Jerusalem Day flag march through Jerusalem, that's more lively and that's more jubilant in a way than anything we could ever organize in Brussels.
Okay, thank you very much, Thomas. So, Mr. Tertsch, there is a different perception, as we said, in Israel and in Brussels about the reunification of Jerusalem. Is the reunification of Jerusalem an illegal occupation, or is a proper unification and is not an obstacle to the peace, as someone in Brussels claims?
No, I don't think it's an obstacle. I think it's the logical way of this is the unification should be the recognition, and the only way to have an open Israel is to have a Jewish Israel, is to have an Israel which is really open as Israel is. Israel is open. Not the outskirts of Israel are not open. At last you have to see who claims the parts of Israel of Jerusalem. I know quite well East Jerusalem
You
as
have
well.
been there, no?
I've been very often in Israel. I've been often in Jerusalem. Almost every time I was in Israel, I was logically in Jerusalem as well. Also, if you were working in Tel Aviv, you always go to Jerusalem. I was in East Jerusalem. I used to stay in East Jerusalem sometimes as well. I've been staying in the American colony quite often. I love this hotel.
Yeah.
It's a gorgeous hotel. And but the thing is, what is the logical development of a city? A city has to be an open city. For this city, it has to have rule of law. It has to have a legal status then, but it has to be a peaceful, open space to develop. And that should be Jerusalem in any future situation, better situation than ours today. Jerusalem has to be an open city, has to be the capital, and then you can look for any agreement for the holy sites and so on, which are only open because it's Israel. If there wouldn't be Israel, Jerusalem wouldn't be open for anybody. We know how things work in other places in the region, and there you haven't the possibility of this combination of having worships in these different worships in such a close space. In this sense, the only way to have an open Jerusalem. An open Jerusalem is to have Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
And what would you say to some European Union officers that they say that their unification, a Jewish and Israeli Jerusalem, is an obstacle to the peace? Are they? What are they aim?
I remember people of the policy of social democracy in Europe who said. To ask for tearing down the wall in Berlin was an obstacle to peace. Who said that it was Cold War warriors, the people who asked for human rights in Czechoslovakia, who said that any kind of blaming the Soviet Union, of being the Soviet Union, or of prosecuting refugees, or killing opponents and so on, that everything was an attack on let's say this tension, peace and stability. I mean, in this sense, I think who wants to stay safe shouldn't rely too much on our dear bureaucrats in Brussels. And when I say that, I mean Israel, as I mean the Ukrainians on the front. If you rely on Macron, Olaf Scholz, and the people here inside this building or the buildings surrounding us, you should better rely on yourself, on your sovereignty, on your physical possibilities, on your weaponry, and on the decision of your people to defend your sovereignty.
And to exist.
This is the main story. That is the main point. The others are, let's say, it's accessories.
It's more political, let's say. Charlie, reunification of Jerusalem, illegal occupation?
Well, I mean, if we look at people in this house, if we look at Europeans in general, I think a lot of Europeans tend to forget about the relationship between the Jewish nation and Jerusalem. I mean, Tomas summed it up very well by stating the old saying of the Jewish people next year in Jerusalem. But the other TLDR version of this relationship is easily to be found on YouTube. It's called Jerusalem of Gold, and I especially recommend the Ofra Hasa version of that beautiful song and the Jewish nation's longing to their eternal capital. Now, if you look at the Tanakh, the city of Jerusalem is mentioned 1,010 times. So this history goes way back. It's 4,000 year old, and I mean, when we also look at the current events during the 20th century, I think a lot of Europeans think, okay, Israel had a superior military. They went in, they conquered East Jerusalem, and that was it. Well, not so fast. I mean, the Jordanians expelled the Jews and ended their 1,000-year-long presence in that city. During the 6 Days War, Israel pleaded to Jordan not to fire artillery and not to take part in that war. They did. So the response was that Israel eventually was able to reunify this city. We should remember that. And we should remind the left of this house that this is the way it all fell. I mean, just look at, if we go back 20 years to the Camp David negotiations back in the year of 2000, the Palestinians refused to acknowledge any connection between the Jewish people and Jerusalem. They accepted that the Wailing Wall was to be part of Israeli sovereignty, but not the Western Wall, not the Jewish quarter. And so that is, in and by itself, an obstacle to peace in this process.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Thomas, Charlie said something extremely interesting, that of course the story is very complicated and it's 1,000 years old, the story of Jerusalem, the Jewish Jerusalem. But now the European Union is pursuing the solution of the two states, pre-1967 lines. That would mean that the west part of Jerusalem will not be anymore under a Jewish control. Is this the correct path to follow for the peace agreement?
So just to slightly correct you, the East Jerusalem would not be any longer under Israeli sovereignty. It's also very important to clarify what exactly is East Jerusalem. It is the historical Jerusalem. When you look at maps of Jerusalem from all these time period, all of Jerusalem was within the walls. And that is today what is called East Jerusalem. So when you, with very little knowledge, if you say East and West, well, just you give one piece to this part and the other piece to the others, it sounds very logical, but it's not. It's basically saying that the historical sites, the old Jerusalem, would no longer be Jewish. And that is, of course, not acceptable for anyone. Again, just to agree what has been said here before, I think the European Union is contradicting its own values by saying that they would rather settle for an Islamistic Palestinian capital with similar rules as in Medina and Mecca, and not go for upholding universal values with coexistence, with openness, with freedom of religion. So on the other hand, to give the European Commission and the External Action Service some credit, I know that this is something that they take very seriously into consideration, so there has been a change in attitude. And obviously anything else would be a disaster because, you know, we see an historic rapprochement between the Arab, the Sunni Muslim states and Israel. And I mean, this should have been the brainchild of the European Union. Absolutely. But we know, you know, those who have had connection with this house for a few years, we know that they always was told that separate peace can never be accepted or achieved. Well, now separate peace treaties are a reality. But why, again, is it the European Union waking up to too little too late? So I think that it takes a lot of humility now for the European External Action Service and for our chief for Joseph Borrell to say, listen, we have to reconsider. And let's start reconsidering by being very firm on Jerusalem and to apply the principles that we all are trying to uphold in this House.
Thank you, Thomas.
If you want Borrell to be humble, I think we will have to wait 3,000 years again for some solution. No, that's not the case. This house has a problem. I mean, the biggest advances have not been done by the solutions they are advocating from here, from all these lobbies, and some we have surrounding Borrell and company. But they were done by the Abraham Accords. They were done by the Abraham Accords, and the problem there is they were done by Donald Trump, and they hate him here, no? And that's anathema. Everything what Trump did is almost anathema, and they don't want to recognize the huge historical importance of these accords and how Arab countries have recognized Jerusalem, recognized Israel as they did, and these immense advances we have had. The thing is, there is a narrative here, discourse, which is very hypocritical, because in reality they are not speaking about Jerusalem. They are speaking about Israel as a whole. Because when many of these people speak about occupied territories, for them whole Israel is an occupied territory.
Is this a sort of also anti-Semitism feeling?
Of course there is this anti-Semitism there, where they say, for them Israel is only a kind of construct. They love Iran. Iran always says this kind of phrase, this intruder state entity, this Zionist entity which we have there and which somehow will disappear in some moment when we can do it and manage it, it will disappear. This idea of territories, it's not only for Jerusalem, it's not only for Ramallah or Gaza and so on. It's for whole Israel, for many of these people. So we shouldn't have there to
there is the existence of Israel
to get into this confusion. They are offended by the existence of Israel, no? And that's but the Arabs are in the forefront of normalization with reality. The social democracy in Europe is the one who is in war with reality all over the places. They are in war with reality in Paris, now in Saint-Denis, where all these attacks by immigrants, which they refuse to acknowledge, and they are at war in Israel, and they are at war with reality all over the places, starting by Europe itself. That's the great problem. Ideology goes before reality in Europe, by the social democratic Europe, and this is the source of our main problems. And one of them is this one, that they don't acknowledge, as the Arabs have done, they don't acknowledge their reality, and to accept reality brings us further into normality, brings us into normality, and then the normality is to accept Israel as the capital of Israel, and to accept that it should be this open city, which only Israel can grant.
Charlie, do you agree with what Mr. Tertsch said? It's like a sort of the European Union woke up very late, and now they don't want to face the reality. They are living in, like say, in some years ago.
Yes, indeed, and Mr. Tertsch is totally right that they hate to admit that the efforts of the former White House administration under Donald J. Trump were successful. They would rather, sacrifice their grandma than admitting, that. But they also have internal fractions of their parties with very strong anti-Israel sentiments. Just go to Sweden. I was reminded of that during the remarks of Mr. Tertsch. 3 years ago, the young Social Democrats of Sweden in Malmö shouted, crush Zionism. And on the 1st of May, their manifestations. And that very much underlines the point that Mr. Tertsch was making about a lack of acceptance for the state of Israel as a whole. That this attitude it's just not a slur on behalf of the right against the left. It really exists in reality in parts of the left in Europe. So how would they be happy that Israel is able to strike peace accords bilaterally with the Arab states? Of course they're not happy, because it takes away attention from their pet project, which is really black painting Israel and talking about the so-called occupation. So yeah, I would give him right on that.
Yeah.
Could I add one thing, because we know that the new president of the European Parliament was in Jerusalem, I think, last week, and I think she said many good things. But one thing, and it has to do with the orthodoxy and the vocabulary of how we describe the conflict. And it's very popular to say, when you want to say something very nice about Israel, you say we accept the right of existence for Israel.
It's like a concession.
I know, just imagine if I would say, well, Marco is rather nice, I accept his existence. That's not how you build friendship, that's not how you relate to such a fantastic state. It's a warm friendship, it's something you want to strengthen, that cooperation, you want to celebrate, not just,
justify somehow.
Yeah. I just think
very
it's
good point.
peculiar.
That's a very, very good point. Mr. Tertsch, Mr. Weimers, you are from Spain and Sweden. Very soon you will have both elections in your own countries, and your party might have a good result during the political elections. If your party will be at the government, what would change in the relationship between Spain and Sweden to Israel?
Well, we are starting now from our local power. It has already started to change with the existence of Vox. That means this awful financing of local governments to these groups in Hamas and in Gaza and in Ramallah, but also to other groups and to so-called resistance group, Palestinian resistance group, which is money which goes all for terrorism, nothing else but terrorism, is one of the things that has happened already, and that is happening every time more. When we are in power, we will grant that Spain has not this kind of official sympathy for terrorist groups, as it still has, and these finance channels to a very, very questionable or NGOs that we have around we have this phenomena of the NGOs is in its worst version in Israel, of course, surrounding Israel, but we have NGOs who are also attacking freedom and the free society all over the places, not only in Israel, which is really one of these degrading developments that we had in the last 30, 40 years. This is one of the things that has to stop. And then, as I say, this hostile, profound hostile position of the left, which they can't avoid towards Israel, that would be banished.
Thank you. Charlie, please.
Well, the current Israeli government has worked quite a lot to improve relations with the Swedish government, which is now social democratic. That is the very same party with a youth organization that is shouting death to Zionism. So, and to a certain regard, the Israeli government has been successful. The relationship has become somewhat better, and the Swedish government actually acknowledges Israel's right to existence, how generous they are. But it will only go that far, because we have those attitudes within the Social Democrats which will stop them from really warming up to Israel. Under this government, the aid to the Palestinian Authority has reached sky levels. I mean, it has been increased more than anything else in our aid budget line. And basically without any questions asked. So the payments to the families of terrorists can go on. The Palestinian textbooks can be full of incitement and anti-Semitism and so on and so forth. So with a new government, I mean, I can take as an example what I did here. I started a debate on the funding of EU to the Islamic University of Gaza, which is basically run by Hamas. And I've been in contact with the commissioner responsible, and maybe some things will happen in that direction. If we get a new government in Sweden, hopefully such a government would be helpful in pursuing that endeavor to stop this funding. Would be helpful in advocating an end to funding to the Palestinian Authority, as long as they don't update their curriculum, their textbooks. As for my party, we are in favor of moving the Swedish embassy to Jerusalem. I'm not sure that our friends in the Moderate Party and the Christian Democrats are ready to do that, although the Christian Democrats are in favor. It's quite sensitive, as you know, but I hope so. It would be an historic step for a country such as Sweden. And I hope that the Israeli government recognizes that a change of government in Sweden, with the support of my party, the Sweden Democrats, would be really a step forward for Sweden-Israel relations.
Thank you for your clarity, Charlie. Thank you for this very interesting discussion that we had today for this edition of the European Report. I'm Marco Gombacci, and see you soon next month. Thank you very much.